And yet, the story of Louis XV refuses to end with the sealing of his tomb, for what he left behind was not just a decaying body or a grieving court. It was a living machine of control, ritual, and illusion that refused to shut down. Versailles remained, vast and humming with ceremonial precision, a monument not to the man, but to the myth he constructed. The courtiers kept their powdered wigs, the ministers recited their memorized lines, and the young Louis XV was placed on a throne far too large for his body. But something had shifted, a subtle crack in the facade, an unease that no amount of marble or music could hide, because when a god dies, it leaves a silence too loud to ignore. In the years that followed, the kingdom tried desperately to maintain the illusion of divine rule, but the memory of the Sun King's grotesque demise clung to Versailles like smoke. His bedroom, once the center of the universe, was now visited with hushed reverence, and some say dread. Servants swore they could still hear his wheezing in the dead of night, the sound of sheets rustling, the soft creak of a slippered step. The tapestries he'd once chosen himself seemed to age faster than the rest of the palace, their vibrant colors fading into a sickly pallor. The gilded moldings above his deathbed darkened inexplicably, and no amount of polish could make them shine again. And there was something else, a series of sealed letters, locked away in the royal archives, which had been marked with a symbol only the king himself had used. A blazing sun scratched over with a single diagonal stroke. It was not until decades later, long after Louis XV had grown into a timid and passive king, that a historian gained access. The contents were startling. Private confessions, observations of decline, dreams filled with dread, warnings. In one, the dying Louis admitted that he no longer believed God had chosen him, but rather that he had chosen God, dressed himself in divinity like a costume, and worn it for so long that even he had forgotten the truth. Another letter described a recurring vision, his own corpse, dressed in gold, crawling across the floors of Versailles, whispering, "Remember me," into the ears of every sleeping noble. Some dismissed the writings as the ramblings of a fevered mind. Others, though, began to see the letters as something far more chilling, a prophecy. For just as Louis had feared, his legacy was not a stable one. The rituals he had perfected were now empty habits. The monarchs who followed him were shadows, performing roles in a collapsing theater. And the people, once too frightened to question the king's divinity, had begun to whisper. In taverns, in brothels, in coffee houses, lit by enlightenment fire, they spoke of freedom, of reason, of equality. What Louis had built as a fortress of divine power was becoming a tomb of hypocrisy. The same palace that had once commanded awe now inspired resentment. Where once there had been worship, there was now rot. And beneath it all, the memory of his death remained, not as tragedy, but as symbol. Artists began to paint darker portraits of the Sun King, his face twisted in agony, his golden robes trailing smoke. Playwrights and poets turned his final days into metaphors for the decay of monarchy itself. In the court, no one dared criticize him publicly, but in the salons of Paris, he was dissected like a corpse on a table. Every contradiction of his reign was exposed. His obsession with God, yet his cruelty to the poor. His love of beauty built on blood and war. His belief in order, even as chaos bred beneath his throne. As the years passed, France's wounds deepened, famines came, and Louis XV turned his face away. Taxes rose and the nobility feasted. Revolution stirred like a monster beneath the floorboards. By the time Louis XVI inherited the throne, the machine was too rusted to move. Versailles, still grand, now felt like a mausoleum, haunted not by ghosts, but by history's judgment. And when the revolution finally erupted, it came not as a storm, but as a reckoning centuries in the making. The guillotine was not just an instrument of death, it was a symbol of purification, a rejection of centuries of rot. And when Louis XVI, the great-grandson of the Sun King, was led to the scaffold, The people did not just cheer for justice, they cheered for exorcism. In that moment, it was not one king who died, but all kings. A severing of the illusion that bloodlines could divine authority. And somewhere, perhaps in the darkest corners of Versailles, the echoes of Louis XIV's final breath twisted into something like laughter, not of joy but of recognition. The end he feared had come to pass. The power he had wrapped in gold had become a shroud. Today, tourists wander through the Hall of Mirrors, marveling at its splendor, photographing its light. But few stop to consider what that light hides, the shadows it was built to blind. They do not see the sweat on the servants who polished the floors, the bodies broken to mine the stone, the lives lost in the wars that paid for the ceiling's gilding. They do not smell the decay. They do not hear the whispers, but they are there, if you know how to listen. For Louis XIV did not die when his breath stopped. He died slowly, piece by piece, as the weight of his myth collapsed inward. He died in the screams of the peasants. He died in the debt ledger. He died every time a courtier bowed without faith. And his final lesson, unspoken but carved into the bones of France, was this: the sun may rise by its own will, but it sets under the laws of time. No man escapes decay, not even kings, especially not kings. And so history does not remember Louis XIV as a god, though he tried. It remembers him as a mirror, one that shows us how power, once untethered from humanity, becomes its own disease, how illusion, left unchecked, becomes infection, and how the brightest lights cast the longest, darkest shadows. They came like ghosts out of the desert, sons of lost dynasties, warriors hardened by exile, priests burning with ancient wrath. From Thebes, in the south, rose a pharaoh who would reshape Egypt's destiny with blood and fire. His name was Ahmose-I, and with him began a new chapter, a rebirth cloaked in vengeance. He drove the Hyksos from the delta, crushed their cities, and purified the land with ritual and war. But Egypt would not return to what it was. No, the pain of occupation had changed the soul of the Nile. The new kingdom would be a different beast, bolder, more ruthless, and far more dangerous. It was no longer enough to defend Egypt's borders. Now the pharaohs wanted to expand them. Empire became the new religion. Under Thutmose III, the warrior king, Egypt's armies thundered across deserts and mountains, conquering Nubia, Canaan, and parts of Syria. This was Egypt at its most powerful, its most imperial. Foreign princes sent tribute, gold poured into temples, obelisks rose like fangs into the sky. But power always comes at a price, and in the shadows of conquest cracks began to form. In the heart of this golden age, something strange happened. A woman took the throne, not as queen, but as king, Hatshepsut, a name that would shake tradition to its bones. She wore the false beard of a pharaoh, commanded temples to depict her as a man, and ruled not through war but through trade, diplomacy, and architectural wonder. Her mortuary temple at Deir al-Bahari still clings to the cliffs of Luxor, a ghost in limestone, elegant and defiant. But history has a cruel habit of punishing those who disrupt its rhythm. After her death, her successor, Thutmose III, attempted to erase her from memory. Statues were smashed, her name chiseled out. It was as if she had never ruled. But history does not forget so easily. Her legacy, like Egypt itself, survived in silence. Then came the heretic, the Sun King, the mad dreamer who would try to overthrow Egypt's very gods. His name was Akhenaten. He abandoned Thebes and built a new capital in the desert, Akhenaten, where only one god would be worshipped, Aten, the solar disk. The temples of Amun were emptied. The old priests were stripped of power. Art changed overnight. Stiff postures gave way to elongated limbs, tender scenes of family life, and surreal, almost alien faces. For the first time, the pharaoh was shown not as a god but as a human, vulnerable, strange, imperfect. Some call it the first expression of individualism in art. Others call it madness. Akhenaten's reign was short, but its impact was seismic. When he died, the priests erased his memory. With fury, his city was abandoned, his monuments dismantled, his god forgotten. In his place rose a boy, barely 9 years old, Tutankhamun. Today, he is Egypt's most famous king, but in his time, he was a puppet, placed on the throne to restore order, to bring back the old gods, to silence Akhenaten's ghost. His tomb, discovered in 1922, was small, hastily prepared, yet it was filled with unimaginable wealth, because the priests needed to ensure the gods would forgive his lineage. And in that tomb, something else was buried. Something more unsettling than gold. Tutankhamun's body was broken, his leg shattered, his spine bent. Scans revealed a skull injury, perhaps a blow, perhaps a fall. But what caused his death is still debated. Was it disease? Was it murder? Was it the curse of his father's heresy? We may never know. But his death marked the end of a dynasty and the return of chaos. Then came Ramses, the Great, the builder, the warrior who sought to outshine every ruler before him. His name is carved deeper into stone than any other. He lived into his 90, almost godlike in longevity. He fought the Hittites at Kadesh in one of the largest chariot battles in history. Though the result was a stalemate, he declared it a victory. And history agreed. Ramses built cities, temples, statues of himself so massive they dwarf the gods beside him. Abu Simbel, carved into a mountain, is his legacy in stone. Yet behind this splendor, Egypt was growing tired. Wars drained the treasury, climate change weakened the Nile, foreign pressures mounted. By the time Ramses died, Egypt was like an aging lion, majestic but slow, surrounded by hyenas. The priesthood of Amun had grown too powerful. Corruption spread like rot. The Valley of the Kings, once a sacred necropolis, was raided by thieves who had once been its guardians. Coffins were smashed, mummies desecrated. Even the mighty Ramses was not spared. His body was moved multiple times, hidden, rewrapped, mislabeled, until it finally ended up in a secret cache with dozens of other kings, stripped of gold, but not of dignity. Yes, Egypt was spiraling. The new kingdom gave way to the third intermediate period, a time of division, where multiple pharaohs ruled at once, each claiming divine right but lacking true power. Foreigners began to fill the vacuum: Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians. Egypt was no longer master of its destiny. Yet the people still clung to ritual. They still mummified their dead, still prayed to Osiris for salvation. Because even in decay, Egypt believed in eternity. But eternity was slipping through their fingers. In 525 BCE, the Persians came. With swift brutality, they conquered Egypt, treating the pharaoh not as a god, but as a governor. Though brief moments of rebellion flickered, they were crushed. Then, in 332 BCE, came a new storm: Alexander the Great. He entered Egypt not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Egyptians, weary of Persian rule, welcomed him. He visited the oracle of Amun at Siwa, where he was declared the son of Zeus Ammon, a hybrid god, Greek and Egyptian. In this, Alexander became something new, a foreigner who embraced the old gods. But he died young, and his empire fragmented. One of his generals, Ptolemy, seized Egypt and declared himself king. Thus began the final dynasty, a line of Greek pharaohs ruling a land they never truly understood. They spoke Greek, not Egyptian. Their gods were alien to the people, but they maintained the illusion of continuity. Temples were built, mummies wrapped, statues carved. It was Egypt's final performance. And in the last act stood a queen whose name would echo across millennia: Cleopatra. A woman of ruthless intelligence, charm, and ambition. She seduced two of Rome's greatest generals, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, in a desperate bid to save her kingdom, but Egypt was no match for the rising tide of empire. Rome crushed her armies. Octavian marched into Alexandria, and Cleopatra, seeing no escape, chose death over submission. Seneca recalled how, seeing her take Martian master, Cleopatra seeing greatest secret. A hope legend says she let an asp, a venomous serpent, bite her flesh. But perhaps it was poison. Perhaps a blade. The truth, like so much of her life, was shrouded in theater and myth. With her death, Egypt died too. The last pharaoh had fallen, the temples closed, the hieroglyphs silenced. For 2,000 years, the sands swallowed everything. Cities, statues, even memory itself. But Egypt was never truly lost. Its ghosts linger in every museum, every desert breeze, every stone face staring across the ages. Because Egypt was never just a place. It was an idea, a dream carved in limestone, painted in blood, sealed in gold. But what happens to a civilization when time itself becomes its tomb? After Cleopatra's fall, the great story of Egypt did not simply end. It sank. Not in flames, but in silence. 1,000 years passed where Egypt no longer belonged to itself. Roman emperors ruled from marble halls thousands of miles away. Temples that once echoed with hymns to Osiris and Isis were repurposed or abandoned. The gods faded, their names whispered only by crumbling statues. Hieroglyphs, the sacred script of the ancients, were declared demonic and forbidden by edict. And so the last voices of the pharaohs were sealed away in stone, unreadable, unknowable. The very soul of Egypt was locked behind a language that no one could speak, and the sands rejoiced in their silence. Egypt became legend, a land of mystery, a cautionary tale. Greeks called it the cradle of wisdom. Romans saw it as a conquered jewel. Early Christians deemed it a place of pagan shadows. And yet, beneath every temple column and shattered obelisk, the weight of its forgotten glory remained. Travelers wandered the ruins, marveling without understanding. The colossal statues of Ramses stood half-buried, as if ashamed. The pyramids loomed, stripped of their gold, robbed of their kings, but still invincible. They had outlived the gods they were built for, but no one could explain them. Egypt became a riddle wrapped in decay, a dead empire that refused to rot completely. And then, in the 7th century, came a new conquest, the Islamic Caliphate. Egypt was absorbed once again, transformed into a vital center of culture, commerce, and scholarship under new rulers and a new faith. Cairo rose from the ashes, a city of minarets and madrasas. But the ancient past was still buried, still mute. Even the name Pharaoh became a distant echo in religious texts, more symbol than man. Egypt's past had become a myth even to its own descendants. Centuries passed. Then, in 1798, the silence cracked. Napoleon Bonaparte, in his thirst for empire, invaded Egypt, not just with soldiers, but with scholars, engineers, and artists. They came to study, to map, to document. And in their wake, the world finally turned its eyes toward ancient Egypt once more. A young officer stumbled upon a slab of black granite near Rosetta, inscribed in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. The Rosetta Stone, a key buried in plain sight, but the lock would not open easily. It took over 2 decades before Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the code, and with that, history exhaled. The pharaohs spoke again. Suddenly, the tombs of kings became libraries. Walls of hieroglyphs burst into meaning. We learned their names, their fears, their rituals. We read the prayers they whispered in the dark, the spells they etched into their sarcophagi, and with every translated symbol, a new horror emerged, a glimpse into a world both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Book of the Dead, far from a comforting guide to heaven, revealed a gauntlet of nightmares, lakes of fire, judgment by monstrous gods, devourers of souls. Death, to the Egyptians, was not peaceful. It was a trial, a war for the soul, and only the righteous or the well-prepared could survive it. Archaeology became obsession. Western powers rushed to plunder Egypt's treasures under the guise of science. Mummies were unwrapped before audiences like circus acts. Sarcophagi were sold as curiosities. Even the dead were not safe. Entire tombs were looted, their sacred contents scattered across museums and private collections. But in 1922, the world stood still once more. Howard Carter, after years of searching, opened a sealed tomb in the sands of Thebes. Inside, gold, untouched relics, and the unbroken gaze of a boy who died 3,000 years ago, Tutankhamun. The boy king had returned from the underworld. But his resurrection brought something darker. Shortly after the tomb's opening, those involved began to die. Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's patron, died of an infected mosquito bite. Others followed: heart attacks, poisonings, mysterious fevers. The press called it the mummy's curse. Scientists scoffed. But the public believed, because somewhere deep inside we all knew, you cannot steal from the dead without consequence. Egypt had warned us for millennia, and we refused to listen. Today, Egypt is alive, a modern nation built on ancient bones. Its past is still being uncovered, still rewriting itself with every excavation. In the sand-choked tombs of Saqqara, new mummies are being found. Priests, nobles, even animals embalmed with reverence. Genetic studies are revealing family trees, migrations, diseases that shaped and ended dynasties. CT scans peer beneath the linen wraps of kings and queens, exposing wounds, secrets, sometimes violence. But even now, so much remains hidden. Over 70% of ancient Egypt is still buried. Entire cities lie beneath the desert. There are pyramids yet undiscovered, tombs still untouched, stories still waiting for their breath. The Sphinx, scarred by centuries of wind and war, refuses to yield her full story. The Great Pyramid still hides chambers we cannot reach. And the gods, though long silent, have not entirely vanished. Their names live on in spells, in stars, in symbols etched into our collective imagination. Because Egypt was never just a civilization, it was, and still is, a mirror. A mirror that shows us our thirst for power, our fear of death, our obsession with immortality. It shows us what happens when we build monuments not just for the living, but for the soul, and what price we pay to preserve them. We see ourselves in their myths, in their pride, in their downfall, and perhaps that is Egypt's final secret, that even after 5,000 years, we are still chasing the same things they were. Eternity, memory, meaning. And like them, we will one day become dust. But maybe, just maybe, our stories will linger, carved into stone, etched into time, just like theirs.